Day 116. On October 7th, 2023, Shabbat and the festival of Simchat Torah, around 2,000 Hamas-led terrorists invaded Israel from the Gaza Strip and rampaged through kibbutzim, towns, military bases, and a music festival, killing, raping, burning, and looting. The ground invasion was accompanied by rocket fire from Gaza, which sent Israelis into shelters. It was in shelters that many met their deaths as terrorists broke down doors and windows and threw in incendiary devices, including grenades. By the end of that terrible day, 1,200 Israelis had been killed and over 240 had been kidnapped as hostages into Gaza. Thousands more had been injured and traumatized, and the damage to property has yet to be fully calculated. On the night of October 7th, the government announced that Israel was at war with Hamas and that the war had two aims: to eliminate Hamas from Gaza and to secure the safe return of all of the hostages. 220,000 reserves responded to the call-up. Even before the official announcement of war, the army mobilized. There were many acts of heroism by soldiers and civilians from all sectors of Israeli society. Kibbutz Cholit was liberated from the terrorists by a female tank crew. Days later, lone terrorists were still found in the kibbutzim, which had been evacuated, in remote areas of the Negev, and in hiding in Arab communities, not necessarily with sympathizers. Arab Israelis were also attacked by Hamas, were killed and taken hostage, and their communities are suffering still from the economic damage of the war as well as the loss of life. Israelis were evacuated from the communities which had been attacked, and thousands more made their own ways to safer places. Within a week of hostilities beginning, communities in the north were also forced to evacuate their homes as Hezbollah intensified its rocket attacks on populated areas. Eventually, the number of evacuees in the country reached nearly 500,000. There was fear that Hamas, with Hezbollah protection, may have attempted a similar infiltration in the north as it had done from the Gaza border. Major towns such as Kiryat Shmona and smaller kibbutzim and settlements have been abandoned. Israelis from both the south and the north are still unable to return to their homes, either because they are still under attack or because they have been destroyed. Although some farmers and volunteers brave rocket attacks to return during the day to tend to their fields or animals. Israel has resisted declaring war on Hezbollah, but has responded to attacks with airstrikes. There is concern that the war in the north may have to follow the one in Gaza. The first response of the IDF into Gaza was air bombardment of known Hamas sites. The ground offensive began 3 weeks later in the north of the Gaza Strip. The IDF soon uncovered many kilometers of tunnels used by Hamas as operation bases, as weapon stores, and also to hold hostages. The entrances were in hospitals, schools, and even cemeteries. Some of the tunnels were wide enough for trucks to drive through and opened out into large central areas. Many were equipped with sophisticated communication systems and proper ventilation. Others lacked ventilation and were cold and mouldy. Evidence that hostages were held in these areas has been discovered. The ground operation has been costly. At least 220 soldiers have lost their lives, many by so-called friendly fire. The largest single tragedy was when 21 soldiers were killed as 2 buildings near the border the troops were demolishing to create a buffer zone for kibbutzim and settlements prematurely collapsed. Soldiers are now operating slowly and with precision in the southern Gaza Strip, finding increasing evidence of the extent of Hamas's military infrastructure and penetration into society. Booty from the homes attacked on October 7th have been found in 1 in 3 homes in the area now being cleared. Hamas continued to send barrages of rockets into Israel, many reaching the center of the country and highly populated areas including Tel Aviv. Ashkelon has been the hardest city in the south, with Sderot, a city which was also invaded by terrorists on October 7th, coming under intense fire. Hamas still has the ability to fire long-range rockets after 116 days of fighting, indicating the extent to which it has been arming and preparing for a long war with Israel, and without Israel or the international community realizing where the money that was supposed to be aid civilian population has been going. UNRWA, the UN agency responsible for Palestinians, did not over the years report any misuse of funds. At least 12 of its employees participated in the October 7th massacre. This has caused most of its major funders, including Australia, to withhold funding while an investigation is underway. The tragedy is exacerbated as there are tens of thousands of refugees in Gaza who need aid, and without UNRWA operating, Hamas will be the most likely agent to deliver food to them, possibly bolstering support for Hamas. There are mixed reports about the attitudes of civilians in Gaza to Hamas. There's ample evidence of widespread support prior to October 7th. At the same time, there are reports of small but significant protests taking place now and calls for Hamas to stop the war. Inside Israel, the civil society immediately sprang into action to absorb evacuees, many of whom needed material and psychological assistance after fleeing the horrors of the massacre, and to stand by the families of the hostages being held in Gaza. Monetary donations reached unprecedented levels, but more importantly, people have given of their time, energy, and skills to ensure that people are supported and the economy does not collapse with so much displacement and so many called up for military service. Women have taken a central role in all of this activity, often going unrecognised. The government, especially Prime Minister Netanyahu, has come under heavy criticism, both for allowing October 7th to occur and for its failure to respond adequately once it did. In the first days of the war, the head of the Shin Bet and the head of the IDF Military Intelligence Directorate and other military leaders, including the Defence Minister, took responsibility for their failures. Prime Minister Netanyahu has yet to do so, saying the time for investigation and laying blame is after the war. On October 11th, Benny Gantz joined what he described as the unity government, taking a place in the elite war cabinet with the Prime Minister and Defence Minister Gallant. Opposition leader Yair Lapid and former Defence Minister Avigdor Lieberman refused to join, saying that they could not participate in a government that included extreme right-wing parties and Haredim. While the war has been raging, the government has had to pass the 2023 budget and make significant cuts to the 2024 budget to cover the costs of the war. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich has refused to make all the cuts to the so-called coalition funds, money promised to secure partners in the government, that his ministry has recommended, and has proposed across-the-board cuts which are still being contested even though the amendments have passed through the committee stages, and the government has told the public that the budget has been approved. There are just 2 more weeks before the budget must be put to the Knesset. The government has also come under criticism for its handling of the hostage situation. 105 of the hostages were released in 4 rounds after negotiations with Hamas, with Qatar and Egypt acting as go-betweens. Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, including security prisoners, were released on the ratio of 3-1 for Israeli children and elderly women kidnapped from their homes. Humanitarian aid was also allowed into Gaza, aid which has increased even in the face of the failure of negotiations for the remaining hostages. The families of the hostages are not united in their attitude towards the war, with a small number saying that destroying Hamas is still a priority, while the majority say that the return of their loved ones comes first, even at the expense of the second war aim. The Israeli public is increasingly questioning the ability of the army to eliminate Hamas, and questioning if military pressure is what is likely to bring Hamas back to the negotiating table. Israel has proposed a 2-month ceasefire for the return of hostages. Hamas is saying that only a complete ceasefire will satisfy them. In the war effort, the United States has been an unwavering ally, with President Joe Biden expressing the greatest support for Israel's right to self-defense ever articulated from America. Germany has also offered full backing. The United Nations General Assembly has passed resolutions criticizing the humanitarian tragedy that the war is having on civilians in Gaza without mentioning the October 7th massacre. UN Women very belatedly made weak statements criticizing the mass rape of women on that day and has refused to make an unqualified condemnation of Hamas's crimes against women. South Africa instituted proceedings in the International Court of Justice claiming that Israel was committing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza. In its interim ruling, the court did not accede to South Africa's request to order an immediate ceasefire, but did ask Israel to do what it could to meet the humanitarian needs of the population. Although many Israelis were offended by the very hearing of the case, most acknowledged that the ruling was not damning. The judgment acknowledged the context of the war following the October 7th massacre and called for Hamas to release all the hostages, a matter not mentioned in South Africa's appeal to the court. The release of the hostages continues to be the major issue in Israeli society and the media. An area outside the Tel Aviv Museum has renamed Hostage Square, and families and their supporters have been there every day. In addition, there have been vigils and protests around the country, including outside the president's home, outside the Knesset, and outside the two homes of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Jerusalem and in Caesarea. Released hostages have been speaking out about the horrors of their captivity and their fears for those still there. A shipment of medications for the elderly, the children, and those with chronic illness was sent into Gaza after a complicated negotiation process involving Qatar and France. There is no way of knowing if the medications reached the hostages. Although protests against the government, which were rampant until October 6th, were put aside when the war began, with many of the organizations that had been protesting the proposed judicial overhaul revamping themselves to support soldiers and evacuees. They restarted 100 days after the war. Many of the families of the hostages have joined these protests, saying that the government needs to change before their loved ones will be released. The most significant criticism of the government comes from the US. Israel has not articulated a comprehensive vision of the day after. There is public support, probably unanimous support, that Hamas cannot have any part in ruling Gaza in the future. Defense Minister Gallant and the Prime Minister himself have said that the Palestinian Authority, which has not condemned the October 7th attack, can play no part. Extreme right-wing members of the government have talked about a return of Israeli settlement in Gaza and the voluntary relocation of many Palestinians from Gaza, a vision that has been ruled out by Netanyahu. However, he has offered no alternative vision. 116 days after Hamas invaded Israel, the country sees no end to the war in Gaza, the likelihood of a war in the north, and Israelis hold grave fears for the hostages. Nevertheless, civil society led by women continues to function and to support each other. Od lo avda tikvatenu, we have not lost our hope. This is Peter Jones-Pellach reporting for the last time in this round for NCJWA Australia.